After being released from prison after 5 years, Anthony decided to visit his late girlfriend's grave. But as he leaned over the tombstone, he turned pale at what he saw. A light rain was falling on the muddy ground as Anthony walked slowly through the cemetery. The cold air carried the scent of wet earth and damp leaves, but he barely noticed. His steps were guided by a mix of pain and resignation. After 5 years of imprisonment, this was his first opportunity to face what was left of Sophia, a tomb, a headstone, and the unbearable weight of guilt he had carried since that fateful night. Upon finding the grave marked with the name he knew so well, a shiver ran through his body. The headstone was simple, with letters carved in white marble that seemed to defy time. Anthony knelt down, letting his hands touch the cold stone. His eyes scanned the details of the inscription, but suddenly he froze. Something didn't make sense. The dates didn't match. They indicated that Sophia would have died before the accident. He ran his fingers over the carvings, as if touching them could correct the obvious mistake. Unease began to grow, suffocating the mourning he had expected to feel there. Anthony stood up quickly, looking around as if searching for answers in the silence of the cemetery. He walked toward the small shed where the caretaker usually stayed. Upon arriving, he found an elderly man hunched over an old table, distracted by a battery-operated radio. "Excuse me, sir," Anthony said, trying to control the anxiety in his voice. "I need some information. How long has this headstone been here?" The man raised his weary eyes, assessing Anthony for a moment before responding. "Which headstone?" he asked disinterestedly. "Sophia Clark's. I heard she was buried here." Anthony's voice faltered at the end of the sentence. The caretaker frowned and scratched his chin before replying. "There's no Sophia Clark buried here. I'm certain of that." Anthony blinked, stunned. "That can't be right. I saw the headstone with her name. It's right there." He pointed to where he had just been. The old man shook his head. "Let me check." He rummaged through a thick notebook of records yellowed by time. A few minutes passed, but the man finally confirmed, "There's no Sophia Clark in this cemetery, never was." The statement hit Anthony like a blow. He tried to argue, describing the headstone he had just visited, but the caretaker remained firm. Anthony felt desperation tighten his chest. If Sophia wasn't buried there, then where was she? And more importantly, why would someone have placed a false headstone? He returned to the tomb, now seized by an urgency that made his thoughts race disorderly. Questions began to form. Who could have done this? Why? But an idea crept into his mind, both frightening and filled with hope. What if Sophia was alive? The thought seemed absurd, but not as much as the feeling that his entire life over the past 5 years had been a big lie. As he walked out of the cemetery, Anthony clenched his fists, as if trying to contain the whirlwind of emotions threatening to explode. He knew he wouldn't find peace in that place. On the contrary, that visit had reopened a wound that had never fully healed. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and he needed to find out what it was. Determination began to take shape in his chest. If there was a hidden truth, he would find it, no matter the cost. After a sleepless night, Anthony couldn't shake the doubts that were consuming him. The idea that Sophia might be alive tormented him, wavering between hope and fear. The next morning, he made a decision. If there was someone who could help him unravel that mystery, it was George, his best childhood friend, and now a police officer in the city. Despite the time and distance that had separated them, Anthony knew he could count on him. He walked through the bustling streets of the city, the contrast between the outside world and the chaos of his thoughts creating a sense of unreality. When he finally arrived at the police station, he hesitated for a moment in front of the glass doors. It wasn't easy to return to that place where he had been treated as a criminal so many years ago. He took a deep breath and entered. George was at his desk, his uniform impeccable and his attention focused on a computer. When he looked up and saw Anthony, his expression was one of surprise, followed by a hint of apprehension. He stood up, adjusting his belt. "Anthony," he said, walking over to him, "I didn't expect to see you so soon. How are you?" Anthony replied with a tired half-smile. "I've been better. I need your help, George. Something very strange is happening." George gestured for him to sit in a chair next to his desk. "What happened?" Anthony quickly explained his visit to the cemetery, describing Sophia's headstone and the absence of records of her burial. He watched George's expression shift from curiosity to concern. "Are you sure about this?" George asked, leaning forward. "Absolutely. I need to know what really happened, George. Something is wrong. None of this makes sense." George remained silent for a moment, assessing the situation. It was evident that he was hesitant to get involved. The last thing he needed was to get tangled in something that could jeopardize his career, especially involving an influential figure like Robert Clark. But the determination in Anthony's eyes moved him. "All right, Anthony, I'll help you. But this needs to be done carefully. We're dealing with powerful people, and I can't take risks without concrete evidence." They began by analyzing the accident records, using George's access to the police database. The initial information seemed ordinary. The report mentioned the death of Sophia Clark, a victim of a car accident. However, when George cross-referenced the data with other files, discrepancies emerged. The death certificate, which should have had details about Sophia, contained generic and even confusing information. More shocking was that the woman who had died in the accident was identified in a secondary report as someone completely different. "This doesn't make sense," George said, frowning as he reviewed the documents. "Here it says the victim was Mary, a woman with a completely different age and background than Sophia. But the death certificate was issued in her name. It's as if they deliberately swapped identities." Anthony felt his blood run cold. George's words seemed to confirm his suspicions. "You're saying Sophia didn't die in that accident?" George looked at him seriously. "All indications are that it wasn't her. And if that's true, someone worked hard to hide what really happened. The revelation hung over them like a shadow." George knew he was entering dangerous territory, but he also understood that he couldn't abandon his friend at that moment. "I'll keep investigating, Anthony, but you need to be prepared for what you might find. This goes beyond an identity swap. If Robert Clark is involved, there could be much more behind it." Anthony nodded, the weight of the situation pressing on his chest. But at the same time, he felt a new strength emerging. He wasn't alone. George was by his side, and together they would get to the bottom of that mystery, no matter the cost. Anthony wandered the city streets like a ghost, searching for answers in places that were once refuges of happy moments. Every corner seemed laden with memories of Sophia. Her laughter, her gaze, everything now distant like a fading dream. He knew that to find the truth, he would need to revisit the past, no matter how much it hurt. The first place he visited was the small cafe where they used to spend their afternoons. The familiar aroma of fresh coffee enveloped him as soon as he entered. The furniture was the same, but the atmosphere seemed empty, devoid of life. He approached the counter, trying to extract some information from the attendant, but no one seemed to remember Sophia. The reality was harsh. 5 years had passed, and he needed to move forward. After leaving the cafe, Anthony went to the central square, where he used to walk with Sophia at dusk. As he observed the wooden benches and the trees swaying in the wind, he noticed a man sitting in a corner, his face partially hidden by a cap. There was something familiar about him, and Anthony approached cautiously. "Excuse me," Anthony began, hesitantly. "You're Charles, aren't you?" The man slowly lifted his head. It was Charles, a former employee of the Clark family who had long since disappeared from the city. He looked dejected, his face marked by time and disillusionment. Anthony, I can't believe it. You're out? Charles asked, his voice low and hoarse. I am, and I need answers. You worked for Robert Clark. Tell me, what happened to Sophia? Anthony could barely contain the urgency in his voice. Charles looked around, as if fearing someone was listening, before gesturing for Anthony to sit beside him. Listen, kid, I shouldn't be talking to you, but... He paused, taking a deep breath. Robert sent Sophia away right after the accident. She was alive, but she was forced to go to another city, far from everyone. Anthony felt his heart race. Why? Why would he do that? Charles hesitated, but finally murmured, because she was pregnant. And Robert would never accept that his daughter had a child of her own. He thought it would tarnish the family name. The ground seemed to vanish beneath Anthony's feet. Sophia was pregnant. He had a child. It was as if all the pieces were starting to fit together, revealing a much more sinister scheme than he had imagined. Where is she now? Do you know where Robert sent her? Anthony asked, gripping Charles's arm tightly. I don't know. I only know that he placed her somewhere far from here and that he had the help of powerful people to erase any trace. After that, I got out of that job. I couldn't continue to be part of it. Charles stood up, looking at Anthony with a somber expression. If you're going to mess with Robert Clark, be careful. He doesn't play around. He already destroyed your life once and won't hesitate to do it again. Anthony stood still in the square, Charles's words echoing in his mind. The mystery was taking on even darker contours, but now he had something he didn't have before, a new reason to fight. If he had a child, he would find him. If Sophia was alive, he would discover where. Determination burned in his chest like a flame that no one could extinguish. He didn't know what awaited him, but he was ready to face whatever was necessary. The dirt road wound through isolated hills, surrounded by tall trees casting dense shadows under the pale moonlight. Anthony drove in silence, his fingertips white from gripping the steering wheel too tightly. Beside him, George was consulting a scribbled map, illuminated by the glow of his cell phone. The property they were searching for was a remote place, one of Robert Clark's numerous discreet holdings that had gone unnoticed for years. George had discovered it while sifting through old real estate records, a forgotten trace in the extensive network of the Clark family's properties. It's here, George said, pointing to a rusty gate that barely stood out in the darkness. Anthony parked the car and got out, his heart racing. He pushed the gate, which creaked as if protesting the intrusion. They walked down a narrow path leading to a modest house, appearing run down. It didn't look like a place of luxury, but it bore the mark of intentional isolation. Are you sure about this? Anthony asked, looking at George. There's no other explanation. Everything points to this place, his friend replied firmly. Anthony approached the door and tried the doorknob, which was unlocked. He pushed it carefully, smelling mold and aged wood. The interior was dark, lit only by the faint light coming from a broken window. The house seemed abandoned, but every corner exuded a sense of buried history. Let's search, George said, pulling out a flashlight. The two began to rummage through the place. The furniture was covered with dusty sheets, and the silence was unsettling. Anthony felt the weight of the moment, as if the walls were hiding the secrets he so desperately wanted to uncover. It was in the small room at the back that he found something. A wooden chest, locked with a simple padlock, resting in the corner. Anthony broke the padlock with a tool George had brought. Upon opening the chest, he found a stack of documents. Among contracts and old letters, something caught his attention, a set of handwritten letters. He immediately recognized the handwriting. It was from Sophia. With trembling hands, Anthony picked up the first letter and began to read. The words seemed to whisper directly to him, bridging time and space. Anthony, my love, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to believe that you will. I'm being kept here against my will. My father forced me to come to this place, saying it was for my own good. I'm pregnant, Anthony. Our child is growing inside me, and he knows. He wants to erase you from my life, to erase our story. But I won't forget you. Never." Anthony's eyes welled up with tears. He continued reading the letters, each one more painful than the last. Sophia described her isolation, her struggle to maintain sanity, and her unwavering love for him. She also revealed how Robert forced her to assume a new identity to make her disappear for good. George watched in silence, understanding the impact of those words. "She tried to reach you, Anthony. All this was to separate you from her and your child," George said, his voice filled with indignation. Among the documents, there was also evidence of Robert's schemes, records of suspicious bank transfers, forged contracts, and explicit orders to cover up the accident that had changed Anthony's life. It was more than just evidence against Robert. It was a window into the labyrinth of lies he had built. Anthony clenched the letters tightly, his chest burning with a mix of pain and fury. The image of Sophia alone, fighting against a system controlled by her own father, filled him with determination. Now he knew he couldn't stop. Sophia was alive. He had a child, and Robert Clark would pay for everything. As they left the house, George carrying the box of documents, Anthony looked up at the starry sky. For the first time in years, he felt he had something to fight for. Sophia's letters were more than proof of her love. They were a call to action. And he would answer it, no matter what was to come. The sound of tires on asphalt seemed distant as Anthony drove toward the neighboring city. His heart pounded loudly, as if trying to break the tense silence inside the car. Beside him, George was reviewing once again the details they had discovered. Sophia was living as Charlotte Morgan, married to Victor Simmons, a respected businessman. It was a new life, built on lies and pressure, but still, she was there, alive. Anthony felt a mix of anxiety and growing anger. He needed to see her, but he didn't know how he would face the truths that would come to light. They arrived in a quiet neighborhood, with tree-lined streets and large houses, all with immaculate facades. George parked on a discreet street, just a few meters from the residence they had tracked down. Anthony stood silent for a moment, staring at the brick house. The lights were on, and he could see shadows moving behind the living room curtains. "Are you ready?" George asked, observing Anthony's tense demeanor. "I'll never be, but I need to do this," he replied, getting out of the car. He walked to the front door, feeling the weight of each step. When he rang the doorbell, the sound seemed to echo through the silent street. A few seconds passed before the door opened. There she was, Sophia, or Charlotte, as she was now known. Her face was slightly different, her features more mature but still unmistakable. Her eyes met Anthony's, and he could see the wave of shock that passed through her. "Anthony?" she whispered, her voice almost inaudible. She looked around, as if expecting someone to appear and stop them. "You shouldn't be here." Anthony took a deep breath, struggling to control his emotions. "We need to talk, Sophia. I can't live without understanding what happened." She hesitated for a moment but opened the door, gesturing for him to come in. The interior of the house was sophisticated, decorated with modern and elegant furniture, but to Anthony it felt like a gilded cage. They sat in the living room, and Sophia looked visibly uncomfortable. "What do you want to know?" she asked, avoiding looking directly at him. "I want the truth. Why did you pretend to be dead? Why did you never reach out to me? And where is our son?" The last question came out more like a whisper, laden with pain. Sophia brought her hands to her face, clearly shaken. "I never wanted to leave you, Anthony. My father, he forced me. After the accident, he said you were dangerous, that being with you would put our son at risk. He forced me to disappear, to change my name and marry Victor, all to maintain control over me and over Enzo." The name of their son, Enzo, sounded like a blow to Anthony. He tried to process everything he heard, but the anger began to grow. "You had a choice, Sophia. You could have fought for us," he said, his voice choked. "You knew what I was going through, what I was losing, and still you let him destroy everything." Sophia began to cry, but soon looked up, her expression determined. "You think it was easy for me. I was pregnant alone, and he threatened me in every possible way. He said he would take my son from me, that he would do to you what he did to so many others who crossed his path. I did what I thought was necessary to protect Enzo." Her words hit Anthony like a blow, but he began to see beyond his anger. Sophia was also a victim, manipulated and forced to make terrible decisions. He felt the anger subside, replaced by a deep sadness. "Enzo, does he know about me?" Anthony asked, his voice trembling. "No. He thinks Victor is his father. It was the condition my father imposed when he forged the whole lie. But Enzo is yours, Anthony." "He always has been," she replied, tears streaming down her face. The weight of those words fell upon him. He had a son, a boy who knew nothing about his existence. Anthony closed his eyes for a moment, trying to compose himself. When he looked back at Sophia, the pain and resentment were still there, but something else emerged, a renewed determination. "This needs to end, Sophia. Your father won't control our lives anymore. He destroyed my past, but I won't let him destroy the future we can still have. I will fight for Enzo, for you, for everything he took from us." Sophia nodded slowly, as if she finally felt there was a way out. Anthony knew the battle was just beginning, but in that moment he found something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The sun was beginning to rise when Sophia, Anthony and George gathered for the first time in a safe place, a discreet inn on the outskirts of the city. Sophia looked nervous, casting furtive glances at the windows and her hands trembling slightly as she held a folder full of documents. The decision to help Anthony and George had not been easy. Betraying her own father, even after all he had done, was an act that haunted her, but she knew she had to act. The truth needed to come to light. "Here is everything I managed to gather over the years," Sophia said, placing the folder on the table. Forged contracts, suspicious bank transfers, names of people involved in his network. "My father is not just a powerful businessman, Anthony. He leads a scheme that involves corruption, drug trafficking, and money laundering. He controls everything, from local politicians to members of the police force." George opened the folder and began to analyze the documents. His gaze was attentive, but filled with indignation. "This is enough to make a big impact, but we need additional evidence, something more direct, so that it won't be dismissed or buried by the people Robert controls." Sophia nodded. "I know where he keeps the most important files, at the main house on the farm, but getting in there will be dangerous. He has guards, cameras, and a system that monitors everything." Anthony, who had been silent until then, finally spoke. "I'll go in. I've wasted too much time letting him set the rules. If this is what we need to expose him, then I'll do it." George shook his head. "We can't be impulsive. If we get caught, Robert won't hesitate to eliminate any threat. We need to plan this carefully." As the trio discussed the next steps, Sophia mentioned something that left Anthony silent. "Enzo. Before we proceed with this, you need to meet your son, Anthony. I know it won't be easy, but he deserves to know who you are." The simple thought of finding Enzo left Anthony conflicted. He knew the boy had grown up believing Victor was his father. Entering his life would mean destroying a part of that reality, but the idea of continuing to be a stranger to his own son was unbearable. That afternoon, Sophia took Anthony to the park where Enzo used to play. From a distance, he saw the boy for the first time. Messy brown hair, curious eyes, and infectious energy as he ran with a ball. Anthony felt his heart tighten. He wanted to run to his son, hug him and tell him everything, but he knew he needed time. "I'll introduce him to you as a friend of mine," Sophia explained. "It's the best we can do for now." Enzo ran up to them, holding the ball. "Mommy, who is he?" he asked, pointing to Anthony. Sophia smiled, though her eyes were full of emotion. "This is Anthony, a friend of mine from a long time ago." Anthony bent down to be at Enzo's eye level. "Hey there, champ. Do you like soccer?" Enzo nodded enthusiastically, starting to talk about the games he watched on TV and his skills. Gradually, the conversation flowed. Anthony felt an immediate connection, but also knew he would have to earn his son's trust. In the following days, Anthony continued to get closer to Enzo, showing up without revealing the truth. The relationship started tense, with the boy hesitating to open up, but small daily interactions began to build a bridge between them. Enzo, little by little, started to admire Anthony, seeing in him something he never saw in Victor: sincerity and genuine attention. Meanwhile, the plan to take down Robert was progressing. George gained access to surveillance equipment and escape routes. Sophia mapped out the layout of the farm, pointing out where the confidential files were stored. The atmosphere was tense, but also filled with determination. Robert always thought he was in control, but he underestimated how capable we are when we fight together, Sophia said, her voice full of conviction. Anthony looked at her and George, realizing that for the first time in years, he had allies by his side. It wasn't just a battle for justice, it was a fight to reclaim his life and protect his son's future. He knew the path would be dangerous, but he was willing to face anything. Robert Clark had made many mistakes, and now he would face the consequences. Robert Clark's farm lights shimmered in the darkness, but what seemed like calmness concealed imminent danger. Robert had discovered Anthony and Sophia's movements. His contacts had informed him about George's approach, the police officer, and the handling of sensitive documents. Robert's anger was palpable. He knew he needed to act quickly to preserve his influence, and above all, his control over Sophia and Enzo. The next morning, Sophia received a call. Robert's cold voice made her shiver. "You're playing with fire, Sophia," he said slowly. "I thought I made it clear what would happen if you betrayed my trust. Are you willing to lose Enzo? Because if you continue with this, he won't be under your protection anymore." Sophia felt the ground disappear beneath her. Fear dominated her for a moment, but then anger took over. For years, she had endured her father's manipulations, but now she knew she wasn't alone. With trembling hands, she hung up the phone and sought out Anthony and George. When she arrived at the inn, her pale face revealed the gravity of the situation. "He knows. My father knows what we're doing. He threatened to take Enzo from me," she said, barely holding back tears. Anthony immediately stood up, his expression stern. "He won't touch our son. Not this time. George, we need to reinforce Sophia and Enzo's security." George agreed, already grabbing his phone to make some calls. "I'll talk to some trusted people at the precinct. We can't involve everyone because Robert's influence runs deep, but there are still officers on our side." While George arranged protection for Sophia and Enzo, Anthony and Sophia stayed to discuss the next steps. "I know you're scared, Sophia, but we need to stay focused. He's trying to intimidate us because he knows we're close to taking him down." Sophia looked at Anthony, determination beginning to replace fear. "I won't let him win again. Enzo means everything to me, and now I know we're not alone." That night, things took an even more dangerous turn. Robert sent 2 of his henchmen to surveil Anthony and Sophia's movements. George, who had noticed a suspicious car circling the inn, decided to take action. He and a fellow officer set up an ambush, intercepting the henchmen before they could act. The scene was tense. George pointed his gun at the men while trying to extract information about Robert's next moves. "Speak now or end up in a cell before dawn," he said, his voice hard. One of the henchmen, realizing there was no way out, revealed the plan. Robert intended to take Enzo to one of his overseas properties, far from Sophia and Anthony. The news hit like a bomb. Anthony could barely contain his fury. He knew he needed to act quickly to protect his son. The next day, while Sophia and Enzo were being moved to a safe location with police protection, Anthony and George prepared for a direct confrontation. They discovered that Robert would be at one of his companies, an office used for discreet meetings with his criminal allies. It was the ideal moment to expose the man who had destroyed so many lives. The night brought a charged atmosphere. Anthony and George, along with 2 trusted officers, infiltrated the building. The evidence Sophia had provided was with George, ready to be presented to the authorities, but they needed to capture Robert in the act. The confrontation was inevitable. Robert was waiting for them. His expression was that of a man who wasn't afraid to risk everything. "So that's it?" he said with an ironic smile. "You think you can take me down? You're nothing compared to what I've built. Don't underestimate what a man with something to lose can do," Anthony replied, his eyes fixed on the man who had destroyed his life. The confrontation escalated. Henchmen tried to stop Anthony and George's advance, but with the help of the officers, they managed to reach Robert. When he realized there was no way to escape, his mask of control fell away, revealing a desperate man. "Everything I did was to protect my family, to preserve what is mine," Robert shouted, his voice echoing through the office. "You destroyed your family, Robert, and now you'll pay for it," Sophia responded, who had arrived at the scene escorted by the police. With the evidence in George's hands and the support of the police, Robert was arrested right there, his influence collapsing like a house of cards. As he was being led away, he cast one last glance at Sophia, full of resentment. "You'll regret this," he said, but Sophia simply turned her face away, determined not to let fear control her again. The danger was not over yet, but Anthony knew they had taken an important step. Now, it was only a matter of time before Robert faced the full extent of his justice. More importantly, Anthony felt that for the first time, his family was a little safer. The courtroom was packed. The atmosphere was heavy, charged with anticipation and tension as the judge announced Robert Clark's sentence. For weeks, the evidence collected by George, Sophia, and Anthony had been presented in a meticulous trial that exposed the true extent of Robert's crimes. Bribery, fraudulent contracts, drug trafficking, money laundering. His criminal network was as complex as it was powerful, but now everything was collapsing. "Robert Clark, you have been found guilty on multiple charges, including corruption, document forgery, and tampering with evidence in legal proceedings. You are sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole," declared the judge as the gavel struck. Robert, seated at the front, looked like an aged and defeated man. For the first time, his mask of arrogance had fallen away. During the trial, pressured by the overwhelming evidence, he confessed to part of his actions, including the manipulation of the accident that had changed Anthony's life. "I did what was necessary to protect my family. At least, that's what I believed at the time," he said in a moment of apparent weakness. "I manipulated the accident evidence. I made it look like Sophia had died because it was easier to distance her from Anthony that way. I used another identity, created a perfect scenario. But no one died that night. He spent 5 years in prison for something that never happened." His words echoed in Anthony's mind ever since they were spoken. For so long, he had carried the guilt of a non-existent crime. The weight of this revelation was overwhelming, but also liberating. Now, with Robert behind bars, Anthony felt that for the first time he could breathe without bearing the burden of such a cruel lie. After the sentencing, Sophia and Anthony had a long conversation. Now free from her father's control, Sophia revealed the truth behind her marriage to Victor. "It was all a sham," she said as they walked through a quiet park. Victor accepted the arrangement because he was also trapped under my father's influence. There was no love, only convenience. He filed for divorce right after the trial. "And now?" Anthony asked, his voice hesitant. Sophia smiled sadly. "Now, it's your turn to build something with Enzo. He needs you, Anthony, and you deserve this time with him." Anthony nodded, understanding what Sophia was saying. He knew there was much to repair, but he also knew his priority was to reconnect with his son. Their relationship was still new and full of uncertainties, but there was something undeniable between them, a bond that only time and effort could strengthen. The days that followed were about rebuilding. Anthony moved to a small apartment near Enzo's school, trying to create a routine. He spent afternoons with the boy, playing soccer in the park or helping him with his homework. Every small step in their relationship was a victory for Anthony. "Daddy, can I show you something?" Enzo asked one day, holding a drawing in his small hands. Anthony still got emotional every time the boy called him father. He took the paper and saw a colorful drawing of a man and a boy holding a soccer ball. "Ah, did you make this? It's amazing, champ." Anthony smiled, feeling a joy he hadn't experienced in a long time. Although the journey was difficult, Anthony knew he was starting something real. Sophia, for her part, dedicated herself to rebuilding her own life, away from her father's shadow and the forced choices he had imposed. She kept in touch with Anthony and Enzo, but respected both of their spaces. On a sunny morning, Anthony went out to the apartment balcony and watched the city. It was a new day, full of possibilities. For the first time in years, he felt that his life was in his own hands. The scars of the past were still there, but now they were marks of survival, not of defeat. He looked at Enzo, who was playing with a ball in the living room, and smiled. His son was living proof that despite the lies and pain, the truth had prevailed. Anthony didn't have all the answers, but he had something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. He took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill his lungs. The past would stay behind, where it should be. It was time to build a future, not just for himself, but for Enzo and the life they could have together. As the sun illuminated the horizon, Anthony realized that for the first time he was truly free. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought about the story. See you in the next video.